October 15, 1973. Harold Brennan extended his hand to Steve McQueen at the Meridian Pictures wrap party. McQueen looked at it like it was diseased. "I don't shake hands with men who destroy lives for profit," McQueen said. 300 industry insiders watched in silence. Harold smiled. Told McQueen he'd never work in Hollywood again. McQueen laughed, turned to the crowd, and said 7 words that ended both their careers. "Ask Harold about Jenny Morrison's screen test." The room went dead. Security moved in. McQueen was escorted out. Within 6 months, Steve McQueen had vanished from Hollywood. But Harold Brennan's real nightmare was just beginning. Because some secrets don't stay buried, some men don't forget. And Steve McQueen had spent 7 years planning his revenge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold Brennan's fingers trembled as he set down his 3rd scotch of the morning. The amber liquid had done nothing to wash away the taste of bile that had been coating his throat since dawn. Outside his corner office on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Pictures building, Los Angeles stretched beneath an October sky that reminded him too much of another October day, 7 years ago. The manila envelope sat on his mahogany desk like a coiled snake. No return address, no postmark he could trace. Just his name typed on a label with the kind of precision that spoke of planning, patience, and purpose. Inside, 23 photographs that proved Steve McQueen hadn't been bluffing that night at the wrap party. Harold's secretary had buzzed him twice in the last hour, but he'd ignored her. Let the calls pile up. Let the meetings wait. In 3 months, he'd be gone from this office, from this industry, from this life he'd built on the bones of better men. But these photographs, these goddamn photographs, threatened to ensure he wouldn't leave on his terms. He picked up the top image again, though he'd memorized every detail. Jenny Morrison, 19 years old, mascara streaked down her cheeks, dress torn at the shoulder. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., October 15, 1973, 23 minutes after Steve McQueen had been escorted from the party. 41 minutes before Jenny Morrison walked out of the Chateau Marmont and disappeared forever. The second photograph showed Harold himself, straightening his tie, checking his reflection in the hotel room mirror. He looked satisfied, predatory, the kind of expression that would end careers, destroy families, topple empires, the kind of expression that proved Steve McQueen had been right about everything. Harold's intercom crackled to life. "Mr. Brennan, your wife called again. She wants to know if you'll be home for dinner." He pressed the button without lifting his eyes from the photographs. "Tell her no." "Sir, she said it's important. Something about the anniversary party plans." "I said no, Margaret." Silence returned to the office, broken only by the distant hum of traffic far below. Harold wondered if Steve McQueen was down there somewhere, watching from a car or a building across the street, waiting to see how his carefully orchestrated revelation would unfold. The man had always been patient, methodical. It's what made him dangerous, both on screen and off. The 3rd photograph showed Jenny's purse on the hotel room floor, contents scattered. Her Screen Actors Guild card was clearly visible, along with a pregnancy test that Harold had forgotten about until this moment. His blood turned to ice water. 7 years. Steve McQueen had waited 7 years to deliver this blow, timing it perfectly for when Harold thought he was finally safe, 3 months before retirement, 2 weeks before the studio announced his successor, 1 day before the industry trades would run their retrospective pieces on his legendary career. Harold reached for his phone, then stopped. Who could he call? His lawyer? Too risky. Attorney-client privilege only went so far when photographs like these surfaced. The private investigator who'd handled the Jenny Morrison situation? Dead from a heart attack 4 years ago, conveniently enough. The 2 Meridian security guards who'd helped clean up that night? One worked for a studio in Vancouver now, the other had moved to Australia. Steve McQueen had been thorough. He'd waited until Harold's allies were scattered or dead, until his power base had eroded enough to make him vulnerable. The King of Cool had played a long game, and Harold was just now realizing he'd been checkmated before he'd even known there was a match. The 4th photograph made Harold's vision blur. Jenny Morrison's face, but from a different angle. This wasn't from that night at the Chateau Marmont. This was recent, Very recent, based on the mature features, the laugh lines, the confidence in her eyes that hadn't been there when she was 19. She was alive. Harold's chest tightened, each breath becoming a conscious effort. Jenny Morrison was alive, which meant everything he'd been told 7 years ago was a lie, which meant someone had been playing an even longer game than Steve McQueen, which meant the cover-up he'd orchestrated, the silence he'd bought, the career he'd destroyed. All of it had been built on a foundation of sand. The phone rang. Harold stared at it through 4 rings before lifting the receiver. Brennan. "Hello, Harold." The voice was older, raspier than he remembered, but unmistakably Steve McQueen. "I trust you received my package." Harold's mouth went dry. "What do you want?" "Justice. Truth. Maybe a little old-fashioned revenge." McQueen paused, and Harold could almost see that legendary half-smile. "But mostly I want you to know that some handshakes matter more than others, and some men are worth more than the empires built on their graves." The line went dead. Harold set down the receiver and reached for the bottle of scotch again, knowing it would be the first of many before this day was through. Outside, storm clouds gathered over Hollywood, and Harold Brennan began to understand that his real nightmare was only just beginning. Harold sat motionless for 20 minutes after Steve McQueen's call, the silence in his office expanding like spilled ink. The photographs lay spread across his desk like tarot cards predicting doom, their glossy surfaces reflecting the gray afternoon light filtering through his floor-to-ceiling windows. He could hear Margaret typing outside his door, the rhythmic clicking a metronome counting down to disaster. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Brennan? Your 3 o'clock is here. The Paramount executives about the distribution deal." Harold closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing against his temples. "Reschedule it." "Sir, they flew in from New York, specifically." "Margaret." His voice carried the authority that had cowed directors, terrorized agents, and built an empire. "Cancel everything for today." He gathered the photographs with steady hands, muscle memory from 3 decades of crisis management taking over. Each image disappeared back into the manila envelope, but their afterimages burned behind his eyelids. Jenny Morrison's tears, his own satisfied expression, the pregnancy test on the hotel room floor, detail he'd somehow blocked from memory until this moment. Harold opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small silver frame he kept hidden beneath quarterly reports. The photograph inside showed a much younger version of himself with Eleanor on their wedding day in 1955. She wore her mother's pearls and that radiant smile that had convinced him he might actually deserve happiness. Behind them, the Pacific stretched endlessly blue, promising a future that seemed limitless. 25 years of marriage. Eleanor had weathered his 12-hour days, his weekend conference calls, his month-long location shoots. She'd smiled through industry parties where younger wives whispered about her husband's reputation, had never asked the questions whose answers would destroy them both. In 3 months, he'd promised her they would travel to Tuscany. He'd retire, they'd find that villa they'd dreamed about, and he'd finally become the man she'd married instead of the monster Hollywood had required. Now those plans crumbled like old film stock exposed to light. Harold walked to his wet bar and poured another scotch, noting how the amber liquid caught the afternoon sun. His hands were steadier now, though something cold had settled permanently in his chest. Through his windows he could see the Hollywood sign perched on distant hills, letters white against the gathering storm clouds. How many careers had those 9 letters witnessed rise and fall? How many secrets lay buried in the canyons below? His private phone rang, the line only Eleanor knew. Harold hesitated, then lifted the receiver. "Hello, darling." Eleanor's voice carried that warm musicality that had first attracted him at a studio Christmas party in 1954. "I know you're busy, but I wanted to confirm dinner with the Richardsons tomorrow. Susan is flying in from San Francisco specifically to see us." Harold remembered Susan Richardson, Eleanor's college roommate, the one who'd become a federal prosecutor. Sharp eyes, sharper mind, the kind of woman who'd recognize guilt from across a crowded room. "I might be tied up," he said carefully. "Harold." Eleanor's tone shifted, taking on that gentle firmness he knew meant she wouldn't be deterred. "You promised. After everything we've postponed for your work, you promised me these last few months would be different." Through the phone, he could hear classical music playing in their Bel Air home. Debussy, Eleanor's favorite when she was planning something special. She was probably arranging flowers from their garden, wearing that cream silk blouse he'd bought her for their anniversary, creating beauty while he sat surrounded by evidence of his ugliness. Of course, he heard himself say, "Tomorrow night. Perfect. I love you, you know that?" Eleanor's voice softened. "Sometimes I feel like we're finally getting back to who we used to be, before all this Hollywood madness consumed everything." The line went quiet except for Debussy's gentle notes. Harold closed his eyes, memorizing the sound of contentment in his wife's voice, knowing it might be the last time he'd hear it. "I love you, too," he whispered. After Eleanor hung up, Harold remained at his window as shadows lengthened across Los Angeles. Streetlights began flickering on, creating a glittering carpet that stretched to the ocean. Somewhere in that sprawling city, Steve McQueen was planning his next move. Somewhere, Jenny Morrison lived under whatever name she'd chosen, carrying secrets that could detonate Harold's carefully constructed life. The manila envelope seemed to pulse on his desk like a living thing. Harold understood now why McQueen had waited so long. The actor had studied his target, learned what mattered most, identified the precise pressure points that would cause maximum devastation. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice served with surgical precision. Margaret's voice drifted through the intercom one final time. "Good night, Mr. Brennan. I've rescheduled your appointments through Friday." "Thank you, Margaret." Harold poured one more scotch and settled back in his leather chair, watching night claim Hollywood. Tomorrow, he would have dinner with Eleanor and her prosecutor friend. Tomorrow, he would smile and play the role of distinguished studio executive preparing for peaceful retirement. But tonight belonged to ghosts, and Harold Brennan finally understood that some handshakes, like some sins, echo across decades. The scotch had long since turned warm in Harold's glass when the second envelope arrived. Margaret had left hours ago, the building's cleaning crew had finished their rounds, and Harold sat alone in his darkened office, watching the city's lights blur through exhaustion and alcohol. He'd been replaying that October night in 1973, trying to remember details that might save him, when the soft knock came at his door. "We're closed," he called out, his voice hoarse. The knocking persisted. 3 measured taps, a pause, then 3 more. Harold frowned. Security should have locked down the building by now. He walked to his door and peered through the frosted glass, but saw only shadows in the hallway beyond. When he opened the door, no one was there. Just another manila envelope on the carpet, this one thicker than the first. Harold's name was written across it in careful script, not typed this time, but handwritten in blue ink that seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights. Harold's pulse hammered against his collar as he carried the envelope back to his desk. His hands shook as he broke the seal and withdrew its contents. More photographs, but also something else. A letter, folded carefully around what appeared to be a cassette tape. The letter was brief, written in the same careful script. "Harold, you always believed I died that night. That was the point. Some deaths are staged, some disappearances are choices, and some silences are bought with more than money. The tape contains the conversation we had 3 days after the party, when you thought you were sending me away forever. I've kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right moment. Steve told you he had photographs. He never told you he had a witness. He never told you the witness was alive, that she's been watching, that she's been documenting. 7 years is a long time to build a case, Harold. 7 years is long enough to ensure that when the truth comes out, there's nowhere left to hide. The photographs Steve showed you were just the beginning. What you're looking at now are the photographs that show what happened after you thought you'd cleaned everything up. The ones that show who helped you. The ones that show what you did to ensure my silence. You have 24 hours to make this right. The address is on the back. Come alone. Jenny." Harold's vision tunneled as he flipped the letter over. An address in Malibu, written in the same careful script. His fingers found the cassette tape, its plastic surface cool against his skin. He hadn't seen one in years. Most of the industry had moved to digital recording. But he remembered that October vividly enough to know what this tape contained. 3 days after the wrap party. 3 days after Steve McQueen had been escorted out for refusing to shake Harold's hand. 3 days after Jenny Morrison had supposedly vanished into the night, Harold had met her at a diner in Burbank, had offered her money, a new identity, a fresh start somewhere far from Hollywood. He'd thought he was being generous. He'd thought he was solving a problem. He'd never suspected she was recording every word. The new photographs scattered across his desk showed a different angle of that same hotel room, but taken hours later. Harold saw himself with two men he'd hoped never to see again. Vincent Torino, the studio's head of security who died of a supposed heart attack, and Marcus Webb, a private investigator who'd specialized in making problems disappear. The photos showed them cleaning, organizing, disposing of evidence Harold had forgotten existed. But the final photograph stopped his heart entirely. It showed Harold handing Vincent Torino a thick envelope, payment for services rendered. In the background, barely visible in the hotel room's mirror, a figure could be seen crouched behind the bathroom door, a young woman with a camera, documenting everything. Jenny Morrison hadn't disappeared that night. She'd hidden, she'd watched, she'd waited. Harold reached for his phone with trembling hands, then stopped. Steve McQueen's call had been a warning shot. This was the declaration of war. Both of them, actor and victim, had spent 7 years preparing for this moment. They'd coordinated their timing, their evidence, their strategy. While Harold had been building his retirement plans, they'd been building his destruction. The city lights seemed dimmer now, as if Hollywood itself was turning away from him. Harold thought of Eleanor, probably asleep in their Bel Air bedroom, surrounded by travel brochures for their Italian retirement. He thought of Susan Richardson, the prosecutor who'd be joining them for dinner tomorrow night, whose sharp legal mind would immediately recognize the implications of what Jenny Morrison possessed. 24 hours. The letter's deadline pounded in his skull like a migraine. 24 hours to drive to Malibu and face the woman whose life he'd tried to erase. 24 hours before his carefully constructed world collapsed entirely. Harold poured another scotch and stared at the cassette tape, knowing that whatever conversation it contained would prove that his sins ran deeper than even Steve McQueen suspected. In trying to silence one witness, he'd created another, one who'd spent 7 years becoming far more dangerous than the actress who'd walked into that hotel room. The game had changed, and Harold was no longer sure he understood the rules. Harold woke slumped over his desk at dawn, the cassette tape imprinted into his cheek and his neck twisted at an angle that sent fire down his spine. The photographs lay scattered around him like crime scene evidence, catching the gray morning light streaming through his windows. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then Jenny Morrison's letter swam into focus, and the previous night crashed back with devastating clarity. His mouth tasted like copper and stale scotch. The empty bottle sat accusingly beside his phone, which was blinking with missed messages. Harold straightened slowly, every joint protesting, and pressed the playback button. "Harold, it's Eleanor. I know you said you'd be late, but it's past midnight. Please call when you get this. Mr. Brennan, this is Margaret. I'm sorry to call so early, but there are reporters downstairs asking about Steve McQueen. I've told security not to let them up, but... Harold, it's Frank Morrison at the Times. We need to talk. There are rumors circulating about some photographs and..." Harold jabbed the delete button, silencing the machine. Reporters. They'd started circling already, drawn by whatever scent Steve McQueen had leaked into the wind. Harold's hands shook as he gathered the photographs, shoving them back into their envelope with desperate haste. The office door opened without warning. Harold spun, expecting Margaret, but found himself facing Mickey Torino, Vincent's younger brother, the one who'd taken over studio security after Vincent's convenient heart attack 4 years ago. Mickey was smaller than his brother had been, but carried the same dead eyes and thin smile that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Morning, Mr. Brennan." Mickey stepped inside and closed the door behind him, turning the lock with deliberate precision. "Heard you had some visitors yesterday." Harold forced his expression to remain neutral, but something cold crawled up his spine. Mickey shouldn't know about the photographs. No one should know except... "I don't know what you're talking about." Mickey walked to Harold's wet bar and poured himself a drink despite the early hour. "My brother left some loose ends when he died. Connections. People who owe favors." He sipped the scotch and made an appreciative noise. "Expensive stuff." Too bad you won't be around to enjoy it much longer. Are you threatening me? Me? Nah. Mickey set down his glass and straightened his tie, a gesture so reminiscent of Vincent that Harold's stomach clenched, just passing along some friendly advice. There are people in this town who remember Vincent fondly, people who get nervous when his name starts coming up in the wrong conversations. Harold's throat felt sandpapered. I haven't mentioned Vincent to anyone. Course not. But that actress, Jenny Morrison, word is she's been talking to journalists, sharing old stories, showing off some interesting photographs. Mickey's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow from decades of cigarettes. Makes people wonder what other photographs might surface, what other conversations might have been recorded. The cassette tape felt like it was burning through Harold's desk drawer. What do you want? Nothing from you, Mr. Brennan. You're yesterday's news. Old man heading for retirement, right? But some folks want to make sure you reach that retirement in one piece. Italy's lovely this time of year, I hear. Peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where a man could disappear completely if he wanted to. Mickey finished his drink and set the glass down with a soft clink. Of course, if someone was stubborn enough to stick around, to maybe drive out to Malibu and dig up old graves, well, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved. He walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Harold? Your wife's a lovely woman. Shame if she got caught in the crossfire of someone else's poor decisions. The threat hung in the air like smoke after Mickey left, locking the door behind him with another deliberate click. Harold sank back into his chair, understanding finally that the game was far more complex than he'd realized. It wasn't just Steve McQueen and Jenny Morrison he was facing. It was an entire network of corruption that had metastasized through Hollywood's power structure over decades. His private phone rang. Harold stared at it, knowing it was Eleanor, but suddenly terrified to hear her voice. What if Mickey's people were already watching their house? What if his wife was already in danger because of sins committed 7 years ago? Hello? Harold? Eleanor's voice carried a tremor he'd never heard before. There are men outside our house. They say they're security, but... Harold, I'm scared. The line went dead. Harold grabbed his keys and ran for the elevator, the manila envelopes clutched against his chest. 24 hours had become 24 minutes, and somewhere in the Hollywood Hills, the past was finally coming home to collect its due. Harold's Mercedes screamed through Coldwater Canyon at speeds that would have horrified him any other day. The manila envelope sat buckled into the passenger seat like deadly cargo while his mind raced faster than the engine. Eleanor's terrified voice echoed in his skull. Harold, I'm scared. Followed by that awful silence that meant everything had gone wrong. He'd tried calling back 6 times. No answer. The winding road blurred past as Harold calculated how thoroughly he'd underestimated his opponents. While he'd been playing chess, Steve McQueen and Jenny Morrison had been orchestrating a symphony of destruction that reached far beyond one studio executive's downfall. They'd anticipated Mickey Torino's involvement, had probably counted on it. Every move Harold thought he was making independently had been predicted, planned for, turned against him. His phone rang, the car phone, not his private line. Harold grabbed it desperately. Eleanor? This is Detective Ray Castellanos, LAPD. Mr. Brennan, we need you to come to your residence immediately. There's been an incident. Harold's vision grayed around the edges. Is Eleanor all right? She's unharmed, sir. But we need to discuss what happened here tonight. How soon can you? 10 minutes. Harold took the last curves of Mulholland Drive like a man possessed, then descended into Bel Air where police cars lined his street like fallen dominoes. Red and blue lights painted his neighbors' mansions in carnival colors, while uniformed officers directed traffic around news vans that had somehow materialized in the hour since Mickey Torino's visit. The circus had found his address. Detective Castellanos was waiting in Harold's driveway, a compact man with intelligent eyes who looked like he'd seen enough Hollywood scandals to recognize another one brewing. Mr. Brennan? Your wife is inside with my partner. She's shaken but physically fine. What happened? 2 men approached your house around 9 p.m., claiming to be private security hired by your studio. When Mrs. Brennan questioned them, they became aggressive, She locked herself in the bedroom and called 911, then tried to call you. Castellanos studied Harold's face carefully. The men fled when they heard sirens. But Mr. Brennan, your wife mentioned something interesting. She said this might be connected to some photographs you received yesterday. Harold's mouth went dry. Eleanor knew about the photographs, which meant she'd been watching, worrying, probably losing sleep while he'd been drowning in scotch and self-pity. I can explain. I hope so. Because those news vans aren't here by coincidence. Someone leaked your address, told them to expect a story. Someone wanted witnesses to whatever was supposed to happen here tonight. The detective's words hit Harold like physical blows. This wasn't random intimidation, it was theater. Jenny Morrison and Steve McQueen had orchestrated Eleanor's terror as a public spectacle, ensuring that whatever came next would play out under media scrutiny. They'd transformed his wife into a prop in their revenge fantasy. I need to see Eleanor. In a moment. First, I need you to understand something. Castellanos stepped closer, lowering his voice as reporters strained to overhear from behind police barriers. I've been a detective for 22 years. I've seen what happens when Hollywood's old guard tries to bury problems instead of solving them. Whatever you're mixed up in, Mr. Brennan, it's bigger than intimidation tactics and mysterious photographs. People are scared enough to make very stupid mistakes. Harold followed the detective's gaze toward his living room window, where Eleanor's silhouette was visible through sheer curtains. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap like a woman waiting for news that would change everything. In the 7 years since Jenny Morrison's disappearance, Harold had convinced himself that Eleanor never suspected, never questioned the long nights and hushed phone calls that followed. Now he understood that his wife's silence hadn't been ignorance. It had been love choosing blindness over truth. The men who came here tonight, Harold said carefully. Did my wife give descriptions? Professional types, expensive suits, polite until they weren't. The kind of men who usually get paid to solve problems quietly. Castellanos studied Harold's expression. The kind of men someone calls when photographs surface that shouldn't exist. The cassette tape in Harold's jacket pocket seemed to grow heavier. On it was proof of how far he'd gone to silence Jenny Morrison, recorded in his own voice 7 years ago when he'd thought himself untouchable. The conversation that would destroy not just his marriage, but any possibility of the peaceful retirement he'd promised Eleanor. Detective, I need to ask you something. Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. If someone had evidence of crimes committed years ago, serious crimes, what would happen to family members who had no knowledge of those crimes? Castellanos' expression hardened. Depends on the crimes, Mr. Brennan, but generally speaking, innocent family members remain innocent, unless someone makes the mistake of involving them further. The warning was clear. Harold nodded and walked toward his house, where Eleanor waited in their living room surrounded by the travel brochures for Italy, the retirement plans, the photographs from 25 years of marriage. All of it about to be swept away by ghosts he'd thought safely buried. As he reached for the door handle, Harold realized that Jenny Morrison's 24-hour deadline wasn't about giving him time to make things right. It was about giving him time to watch everything he loved turn to ash first. Harold stepped through his front door to find Eleanor standing in their hallway, travel brochures scattered at her feet like fallen leaves. She wasn't the shaken victim he'd expected to console. She stood perfectly straight, her silver hair immaculate, her eyes holding a steadiness that made his stomach drop. Hello, Harold? Her voice carried no trace of the terror he'd heard on the phone. I was wondering when you'd finally come home. Detective Castellanos followed him inside, and Harold noticed how Eleanor's gaze flicked to the detective with something that looked almost like relief. Not the relief of a frightened woman seeing protection. The relief of someone whose careful plan was finally moving forward. Eleanor, are you all right? When you called, you sounded terrified. She bent to collect the travel brochures, her movements deliberate and calm. Yes, I imagine I did. One develops quite an acting ability after 25 years of marriage to a man who thinks he's the only one with secrets. Harold's vision seemed to telescope. The familiar hallway, their wedding photo on the side table, Eleanor's collection of Italian pottery, the grandfather clock that had belonged to her parents, suddenly felt like a movie set where he'd forgotten his lines. I don't understand. Eleanor straightened, holding the brochures against her chest. Detective Castellanos, would you mind giving us a moment? I believe my husband and I need to discuss some family matters before you take his statement. The detective hesitated, studying both their faces. Mrs. Brennan, if you're not comfortable being alone with... Oh, I'm perfectly safe. Eleanor's laugh was soft, almost musical. Harold would never hurt me. He loves me far too much to risk losing his retirement plans. Isn't that right, darling? Harold felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Eleanor, what's happening here? She walked past him into the living room, where the remnants of their evening, 2 wine glasses, the newspaper crossword they'd started together, Eleanor's reading glasses, created a tableau of domestic normalcy that now felt obscene. Harold followed, aware that Detective Castellanos was watching from the doorway. I met Jenny Morrison yesterday, Eleanor said conversationally, settling into her favorite armchair. Lovely girl. She's matured beautifully since that unfortunate business 7 years ago. We had tea at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Very civilized. The cassette tape in Harold's pocket felt radioactive. You met with Jenny Morrison. She called Tuesday morning, introduced herself, suggested we talk. I was curious, naturally. A young woman contacting me out of nowhere, mentioning your name, asking if I knew about certain photographs. Eleanor smiled with the same warmth she'd shown him every morning for a quarter century. Imagine my surprise when I realized she wasn't some delusional starlet or blackmail artist. She was someone who'd been watching our marriage very carefully for years. Harold sank onto the sofa, his legs unable to support him. Eleanor, she showed me quite a collection of photographs, Harold, not just from that hotel room in 1973, but from afterwards. Pictures of you meeting with various unsavory gentlemen, pictures of you disposing of evidence, pictures of you paying for services that I'm sure weren't listed in any studio budget. Eleanor's voice remained conversational, as if discussing their dinner plans. But do you know what fascinated me most? Harold couldn't speak. The room spun around him while his wife, his beloved innocent wife, revealed herself as someone he'd never met. She had photographs of our house, taken over the years, pictures of you burning papers in our fireplace, pictures of you burying something in our garden, something I now realize wasn't the cat we told the neighbors about. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. She's been watching us, Harold, watching me, documenting how I watered the roses over that particular patch of earth, how I never questioned why the soil was so rich there, how I never asked why you insisted on doing all the gardening yourself. The truth crashed over Harold like a physical force. Jenny Morrison hadn't just survived. She'd been studying his entire life, mapping his vulnerabilities, identifying every person he cared about, and Eleanor hadn't been an innocent bystander in his corruption. She'd been an unwitting accomplice, complicit in ways she was only now discovering. The men who came here tonight, Harold whispered, were Jenny's associates, yes. The whole scene was performance art, really. We needed Detective Castellanos to see you panicked, desperate, rushing home to protect your innocent wife. Eleanor's smile never wavered, because when you disappear tomorrow, when you drive to Malibu to meet Jenny and simply never come home, I'll be the grieving widow who cooperated fully with the investigation. Detective Castellanos stepped into the room. Mrs. Brennan, I think we've heard enough. Harold looked between them and understood that his 25-year marriage had been a lie. Not because Eleanor had been deceiving him, but because his sins had poisoned everything they'd built together, turning his wife into an accessory to murder she'd never known she was committing. You're not innocent, he breathed. Eleanor's expression finally cracked, revealing something broken underneath. Neither are you, darling. The difference is, I'm going to survive this. Harold stared at his wife as the implications crystallized with terrifying clarity. Eleanor wasn't just betraying him, she was orchestrating his destruction with the same methodical precision she'd brought to 25 years of managing their household. The woman who'd arranged dinner parties for studio executives, who'd smiled through charity galas while he made backroom deals that destroyed careers, had been absorbing every detail of his corruption. How long have you known? Harold's voice cracked like an adolescent's. Eleanor rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to the mantelpiece where their wedding photo sat among Italian pottery she'd collected during happier trips abroad. I've suspected for years, Harold. The phone calls that ended when I entered rooms. The way you'd disappear for hours after premieres, claiming studio emergencies. The cash withdrawals from accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. She touched the wedding photo with one finger, but I didn't know the specifics until Jenny showed me what you did to that girl in 1973. Detective Castellanos remained silent in the doorway, his presence both protective and predatory. Harold realized the detective wasn't here to investigate. He was here to witness the final act of a performance that had been planned down to the smallest detail. The cassette tape, Eleanor continued, turning from the mantelpiece with eyes that held no trace of the woman he'd shared breakfast with that morning. The one in your jacket pocket right now. Jenny told me about that too. Your conversation with Vincent Torino about disposing of evidence. Your discussion of how to make a young woman's disappearance look voluntary. Harold's hand moved involuntarily toward his pocket, confirming what Eleanor already knew. The gesture felt like signing his own death warrant. She's not just alive, Harold. She's been planning this for 7 years, building a case, collecting evidence, studying everyone connected to what happened that night. Eleanor's voice carried an awful admiration. She knows about the studio executives who helped cover it up, the journalists who killed stories, the coroner who falsified reports about that other girl, the one they found instead. The room temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. What other girl? Eleanor's laugh was brittle as winter glass. Oh, darling. Did you really think Jenny Morrison was the only victim? Did you believe Vincent Torino when he told you they'd handled everything quietly? Jenny Morrison escaped that hotel room. Some other poor girl didn't. The truth hit Harold like a physical blow. The body found 3 days later in a Hollywood Hills ravine, identified as a runaway from Phoenix, had been staged. While Harold had spent 7 years believing Jenny Morrison was dead, buried in his garden, she'd been alive, and an innocent girl had died in her place. You've been watering roses over a stranger's grave, Eleanor said softly, telling me how beautiful they bloomed each spring, making me complicit in murder I didn't even know I was committing. Harold looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw 25 years of careful performance crumbling away. The devoted spouse, the perfect studio wife, the woman who'd never asked uncomfortable questions because she'd been too afraid of the answers. Underneath was someone harder, smarter, infinitely more dangerous than he'd ever suspected. What do you want from me? Harold whispered. Nothing anymore. Eleanor walked to the window, gazing out at the police cars and news vans. Jenny wants you at Point Doom tomorrow at sunset. Alone. She says Steve McQueen will be waiting. Steve McQueen is dead. Is he? Eleanor turned back to Harold, and for the first time her composure wavered slightly. Jenny showed me recent photographs, Harold. A man who looks remarkably like McQueen, living quietly in Mexico under another name. Apparently, faking your own death isn't as difficult as one might think when you have friends with the right connections. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Steve McQueen hadn't died of cancer in 1980. He'd disappeared, just as Jenny Morrison had disappeared, waiting for the moment when Harold was most vulnerable to strike back. His retirement party, his moment of triumph, had been the opening move in a game Harold never realized he was playing. They're going to kill me, Harold said, and was surprised by how calm his voice sounded. Perhaps, or perhaps they'll offer you a choice. Eleanor's smile returned, cold and perfect. Jenny was quite specific about that. You'll have options, she said, the same options you gave her 7 years ago. Detective Castellanos cleared his throat. Mr. Brennan, I think it's time we had that conversation about the photographs. Harold looked between his wife and the detective, understanding finally that there was no escape, no clever maneuver that would save him. Jenny Morrison and Steve McQueen had spent 7 years building an inescapable trap, and Eleanor, his Eleanor, had become their willing executioner. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the beginning of Harold's final day. Harold stared at the detective's expectant face while his world collapsed into fragments of betrayal and revelation. The cassette tape in his pocket felt like a loaded gun, and Eleanor's transformed presence beside him radiated a cold satisfaction that made his skin crawl. 25 years of marriage had been built on lies. Not the lies he'd told her, but the lies she'd told herself to survive loving a monster. The photographs, Detective Castellanos repeated, stepping closer. Jenny Morrison showed you quite a collection, didn't she, Mrs. Brennan? Eleanor nodded, her composure returning like armor sliding back into place. Comprehensive documentation spanning 7 years, Detective. Harold's activities have been rather meticulously recorded. Harold found his voice, though it emerged as a stranger's whisper. You planned this, all of it. The threats tonight, bringing the police here, the media circus outside. He looked at Eleanor with something approaching awe. You've been planning this for months. Since the moment Jenny Morrison called me. Eleanor's admission carried no shame, only weary relief. She was very persuasive about the benefits of cooperation. Immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony, protection for family members who had no knowledge of criminal activities, a chance to salvage something from the wreckage of our marriage. The detective withdrew a small recording device from his jacket, setting it on the coffee table between them like a judge's gavel. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to need you to tell me about the night of March 15th, 1973. About what happened at the Beverly Hills Hotel after Steve McQueen refused to shake your hand. Harold's throat constricted. The memory rose unbidden. McQueen's contemptuous dismissal, the rage that had followed, the phone call to Vincent Torino that had set everything in motion. He'd been drunk on power and humiliation, demanding satisfaction from the one actor who'd never shown him proper respect. I can't do this, Harold said, standing abruptly. The room spun around him, family photos and Italian pottery blurring into accusatory faces. Eleanor, please. Whatever they've promised you, whatever deal you think you've made, sit down, Harold. Eleanor's voice cut through his panic with surgical precision. There's more you need to hear. She moved to their desk in the corner, withdrawing a manila envelope identical to the one Harold had received the previous morning. Inside were photographs, but not the hotel room images he expected. These showed a young woman, alive, healthy, standing outside a modest house in what looked like suburban Mexico. Jenny Morrison, photographed 2 weeks ago, Eleanor said, spreading the pictures across the coffee table. She's 31 now, married to a local teacher, expecting her first child. She's built quite a nice life for someone who was supposed to be dead. Harold sank back onto the sofa, studying the images. The girl from 1973 had become a woman of quiet dignity, her face holding traces of the terror she'd survived, but also strength Harold had never imagined she possessed. In one photograph, she stood beside a man whose profile made Harold's blood freeze. Steve McQueen. Older, grayed, wearing simple clothes that couldn't disguise the predatory grace that had made him a star. Very much alive. He's been protecting her all these years, Eleanor continued. After you tried to have her killed, McQueen helped her disappear. Faked his own death when the cancer story became convenient cover. They've been waiting, Harold. Waiting for the perfect moment to destroy you. Detective Castellanos leaned forward. Mr. Brennan, we have evidence that you conspired to commit murder in 1973, that you covered up the death of an innocent woman whose body was used to stage Jenny Morrison's disappearance. We have recordings, financial records, testimony from surviving members of Vincent Torino's organization. Harold pulled the cassette tape from his pocket, staring at it as if it were a venomous snake. His own voice was trapped inside, confessing to crimes that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. But looking at the photographs of Jenny Morrison, alive, safe, building the life he'd tried to steal from her, he felt something unexpected. Relief. The burden he'd carried for 7 years, the nightmares that had plagued his sleep, the constant fear of discovery. It was ending. Not the way he'd planned, not with the peaceful retirement he'd promised Eleanor, but with a reckoning that was overdue. She wants to meet with me, Harold said quietly. Tomorrow at Point Doom. She wants you to choose, Eleanor corrected. The same choice you gave her 7 years ago. Run or die. Harold looked at his wife one final time, seeing the woman she'd become through exposure to his poison. Strong enough to survive his destruction, clever enough to save herself, broken enough that love had curdled into something indistinguishable from justice. No, he said, pressing the cassette tape into Detective Castellanos' hand. I'm done running. For the first time in 30 years, Harold Brennan chose to face the truth of what he'd become. Detective Castellanos pocketed the cassette tape with the careful reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. Harold watched his confession disappear into official custody and felt the last threads of his constructed life dissolve. The recording would play in courtrooms, be transcribed in depositions, become evidence exhibits that would outlive everyone in this room. His voice, admitting to conspiracy and murder, would echo through legal proceedings for years. "I'll need you to come with me, Mr. Brennan," the detective said, though his tone suggested this was courtesy rather than request. "We have several hours of questions ahead of us." Harold nodded, surprised by the steadiness of his own breathing. For 7 years, every phone ring had triggered panic. Every unexpected visitor had promised exposure. Now that the moment had arrived, he felt only exhaustion and an odd gratitude that the performance was finally ending. Eleanor stood by the window, silhouetted against the chaos of news vans and police cars. She'd orchestrated this spectacle with the same attention to detail she'd brought to their dinner parties, ensuring maximum visibility for Harold's downfall. The neighbors would watch him led away in handcuffs. Tomorrow's headlines would dissect his empire's collapse. The industry he'd ruled through fear would feast on his destruction. "Eleanor," Harold said as Castellanos moved toward the hallway. She turned, and for a moment he glimpsed the woman he'd married, vulnerable, hopeful, believing in the possibility of love without conditions. Then her expression hardened back into the mask she'd perfected during their conversation. "Don't expect me to visit you, Harold. Whatever prison they send you to, whatever sentence you serve, consider our marriage dissolved effective tonight." The words should have devastated him, but Harold felt only a dull acceptance. Their marriage had died years ago, poisoned by secrets that had transformed Eleanor from accomplice to executioner. He'd made her complicit in horrors she'd never chosen, forced her to water roses over a stranger's grave while believing herself innocent. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it completely for perhaps the first time in decades. "For all of it. For what I made you become." Eleanor's laugh was bitter as winter coffee. "You didn't make me anything, Harold. I chose to survive loving you. I chose to build a life with someone who destroyed people for sport. Those were my decisions." The detective's hand settled on Harold's elbow with gentle firmness. "We need to go, Mr. Brennan." As they walked toward the front door, Harold took inventory of the life he was leaving behind. The grandfather clock that had belonged to Eleanor's parents, marking time that had run out. The wedding photo on the side table, capturing a moment of happiness that had curdled into mutual destruction. The Italian pottery Eleanor had collected during trips that now seemed like scenes from someone else's marriage. Outside, camera flashes exploded like artillery fire. Reporters shouted questions that blended into incomprehensible noise, while photographers documented every step of Harold's perp walk. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to provide the dramatic shots they craved. Let them remember him as unremarkable, a tired man in an expensive suit who'd finally run out of places to hide. The police car's interior smelled of disinfectant and desperation. As they pulled away from his Bel Air home, Harold caught a final glimpse of Eleanor in the living room window. She stood motionless, watching his exit with the same detached interest she might show a mildly engaging television program. Tomorrow she would begin dismantling their shared life, selling properties, changing bank accounts, rebuilding herself into someone who'd never been married to a monster. Point doom. Jenny Morrison and Steve McQueen would wait there tomorrow evening, expecting Harold to fulfill his half of whatever bargain Eleanor had negotiated. But there would be no dramatic confrontation, no final showdown between old enemies. Harold would spend tomorrow in an interrogation room, confessing to crimes that would ensure he died in prison. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 30 years destroying careers, ruining lives, wielding power like a weapon against anyone who challenged his authority. Now his empire would collapse not through dramatic revelation, but through simple paperwork, police reports, court filings, plea agreements that would unravel everything he'd built. Detective Castellanos drove in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing at Harold in the rearview mirror. The detective had seen this before, powerful men reduced to their essential components, stripped of wealth and influence, until only human frailty remained. Harold represented nothing special. Just another criminal whose luck had finally expired. As downtown Los Angeles approached through the windshield, Harold closed his eyes and thought about the young actress he'd tried to murder 7 years ago. Jenny Morrison had survived his worst impulses, built a new life in Mexico, found love despite the trauma he'd inflicted. Her child would grow up never knowing how close its mother had come to destruction, never understanding that monsters like Harold Brennan existed in the world. Perhaps that was justice enough. Harold would disappear into the prison system while Jenny Morrison raised her family in peace. Steve McQueen would continue his quiet exile, having orchestrated perfect revenge without throwing a single punch or firing a shot. The car pulled into the police station parking garage, and Harold Brennan's career as Hollywood's most ruthless studio executive officially ended.